Okay, I can start. So, welcome to this session on implications of large global shocks on macro modeling, which is organized by the Bank of Finland. And I'm co-chairing this together with Jokivuolle, also from the Bank of Finland. And I'm Juha Kilponen from the Bank of Finland, Head of Monetary Policy and Research. We have 3 papers, one on global uncertainty by Efrem Castelnuovo, then on COVID-19 scarring and fiscal policy by Michaela Elfsbacka Schmöller, and then the 3rd paper on counterfactual economic analysis of COVID-19 using a threshold augmented multi-country model by Alessandro Rebucci. We will have 20 to 25 minutes per speaker, then 10 minutes by discussant, and 10 minutes for general discussion. And the first paper is by Efrem Castelnuovo. And Efrem, the floor is yours.
Oh, yes, thank you very much, Juha. So thanks to the organizers for accepting our paper, and to the Bank of Finland in particular for organizing this fantastic session. So this global uncertainty, joint work with Giovanni Caggiano, Monash University. This is a paper about the effects of global financial uncertainty, and in particular the business cycle effects when it comes to the Great Recession. And I guess the motivation of this paper is actually written there. So according to Serena Eng and Jonathan Bright, thinking about recessions, recent recessions, apart from the pandemic one, the origins are financial, this can be said thinking about the recessions since 1985. There was a lot of uncertainty during the Great Recession in particular, and the Great Recession was exceptionally global in nature. And so we want to sort of link these 3 terms, financial uncertainty and global, in this paper. And the question we are asking is actually written down there in red, real effects of global financial uncertainty due to the Great Recession. We want to sort of try to understand if the spikes in global financial uncertainty were important important drivers of the real recession we observed during the great during the 2007, 2008, and following years period. So what we do in this paper is 2 things. So first, to talk about a global financial uncertainty shock. Basically, we need a measure of global financial uncertainty. And so we propose a novel measure of this concept based on a large number of financial volatility series. We handle a data set covering 42 countries for a fairly long sample. We have a large number of observations to estimate this factor. It's a latent factor. We're going to estimate this factor by trying to sort of considering the fact that these 42 countries can be classified in different regions. Each one of them might have its own specificities. And so we're going to have a factor structure acknowledging the fact that on top of a global factor, there's also regional factors and country-specific factors, okay? Once estimated, this factor is going to be placed in a VAR in order to identify hopefully exogenous variations in the global financial uncertainty measure we have, for eventually understanding and quantifying the real effects of GFU shock at a global level. And so what we're going to use is basically mainly a non-recursive identification strategy in order to identify these GFU shocks. Although we'll have a comparison with a recursive approach, which has been asked by a number of referees, and so we're going to show that the recursive approach would not necessarily work as well as the non-recursive one. We are going to model the world industrial production measured by Baumeister and Hamilton as a real indicator. So that's going to be our reference for the global business cycle. We're going to control for, say, first moment global financial shocks by including in our VAR the global financial cycle indicator recently proposed by Miranda Grippino and Ray. Okay. Findings, we find the GFU to spike in correspondence to easy to label global events. So the GFU measure GFU standing for global financial uncertainty is not surprising in the sense that it's going to spike in where you would expect it to spike. It correlates with the measures of global uncertainty, although it's more volatile than that, and we believe it's actually important for us in the sense that the identification of financial shocks is going to be easier than identification of macro shocks. It correlates our measure with measures of US financial uncertainty like the VIX, which are, in our opinion, good proxies of the global financial uncertainty. Therefore, and this is probably non-surprising given the role as an hegemon of the US economy when it comes to financial markets. We find these GFU shocks to be relevant drivers of the global financial as well as business cycles. When it comes to the contribution to the world industrial production loss during the Great Recession, we find 13% as a reference number, and I'll explain later how we came up with this figure. Say that the contribution is non-negligible. That would be the statement in the paper we have. And finally, we find a correlation which we label global finance uncertainty multiplier. This correlation basically suggests that when financial markets at a global level go in trouble, there's a bigger loss in real terms with respect to when financial markets don't go in trouble. And I'll try to explain later how we kind of differentiate between interpretations of the data suggesting that financial markets did not go in trouble after the GFU shock, and different interpretations suggested that also financial markets were in trouble after, in response to an increase in global financial uncertainty. Okay, so I just have 20 minutes, so I guess I'm gonna skip the literature. I'm gonna present the dynamic factor model we estimate in order to come up with the global financial uncertainty factor. Then I'm gonna compare this factor to a variety of other measures of global financial uncertainty and domestic uncertainty, US uncertainty in particular, via analysis and conclusions. That's actually the plan of the presentation. Okay, let me skip the literature, although I'm very happy that Ambrogio was asked to discuss this paper, because with Pesaro and Rebucci, they got a fantastic paper dealing with similar research questions, similar issues. So I'm really looking forward to seeing, to enjoying Ambrogio's discussion. So let me move to the dynamic factor model. So I said before, we have 122 financial volatility series. These are monthly volatility series computed as realized volatility of daily financial indexes. So you can think of this guy as being one financial volatility series which belongs to a certain region, R, country C. It's one of the three series we have in terms of financial volatility. I'm going to be talking about stock price volatility, exchange rate volatility, and government yields volatility. So N is one of the three, and T is the time index. Okay, so we got four indexes here, identifying the region I belong to as a series. Say I belong to North America, for instance. The country US, I'm like stock price volatility, and T is a given month of the sample we are analyzing. Okay, so we relate this observable to a country specific factor. And we got loadings here, which we estimate jointly with the factor, okay? And then there's a country-specific, actually I should say, observable-specific residual here, which soaks up actually all it's not explained by this country-specific factor. Now, this country-specific factor is related to region-specific factors, and these region-specific factors are related to the global financial uncertainty measure we estimate. Okay, so this guy is actually a common driver of observables, of the observables so we have in our database. You can actually substitute here C from the second to the first equation, and R from the third to the second equation, and you'll actually see a restricted relationship between the observables we have and the global financial uncertainty measure we estimate. So this is really a common factor across the observables we are modeling. Okay, so we estimate this structure after the usual transformation of the variables you actually go for when you estimate a dynamic factor model. This is one of the versions of the dynamic factor model you can go for. It's a bit different with respect to Coase et others, or Stock and Watson, or Jackson and others. This is the version of the model developed by Eng, Mönk, and Potter. And the advantage of this frequentist approach is actually that it's a parsimonious approach that does not necessarily require these factors to be orthogonal. So you can think of this global financial uncertainty factor being correlated to a regional factor like the one in North America, or a country-specific factor like the US one. Okay, and we see this in terms of interpretation as an advantage of this approach. Okay, now data, we have 122 series, as I said, monthly volatility of stock market indexes, exchange rates, and bond yields. The same data is basically, turns out that Baker and Bloom have studied for another paper, a paper concerned with uncertainty shocks at a world level. This is the sample we are studying. These are the 42 countries we have in our database. These are 5 regions, the regions I was talking about before. These countries actually cover about 80% of the GDP worldwide. So we think it's a good representative sample for studying the business cycle at a world level. And there's some missing data here. This is an unbalanced sample. So we actually implement the EM algorithm by Bambura and Modugno in order to handle this missing data. Okay. So this is the GFU factor that would be like this series we produced for this paper. And so this guy, as you kind of, could expect, even before estimating the sample, features a lot of peaks. It's actually a financial volatility factor after all. The largest peak comes in correspondence of the global financial crisis, which is possibly not too surprising. The second one comes in correspondence to COVID-19. Again, this is similar to what you find in the VIX, for instance, in the US. And other peaks are very easy to interpret when it comes to events associated with them. In particular, it's interesting here that this is not just a US, if you want, indicator, in the sense that you find evidence in favor of events worldwide that might justify these peaks. Although, again, I anticipate this is very highly correlated to the VIX in the US, for instance. In terms of correlation, this guy, as I anticipated, is pretty correlated to the VIX. It's kind of correlated also to the global financial cycle by Miranda, Agrippina, and Ray. We are going to model later jointly with our indicator. And it's also correlated with the financial uncertainty measured by Rubinson and others, again, for the US. So these first 2 correlations actually are fairly high, and sort of, in our opinion, document the fact that US proxies for financial volatility are good proxies of the global financial uncertainty if we believe in our indicator. The global financial cycle is positively correlated with respect to our indicator, but not so largely correlated. In our opinion, this means that you can actually hope to extract different information from the 2 when you go to a VR analysis. Okay. Now, Antti, so we haven't, Antti, thanks for the question. Antti is asking if there's a difference between the filtered and smoothed estimates of the GFU. For the moment, we've just looked at the smoothed estimates, which is actually what I'm proposing you here. We have to check the filtered, to see, if there's a big difference or not. Okay, that would be my answer to the question. Thanks for the question. Okay, so let me move to the next slide. Okay, and this slide is to show you that this is really a financial uncertainty indicator at a global level. So it is correlated with the macro uncertainty indicator. So the correlations are not extremely large. Interestingly speaking, it's more correlated with other measures that have been produced with factor models than the measures produced with the texture analysis, say the one by Baker, Bloom, and Davis, or the one by Nick Bloom and other people at the IMF, or the GPR measure by Caldara and Jacobiello from the board. So the correlations here are pretty low. What this means is that, this indicator, the one we are producing, is not necessarily equivalent to other indicators that are already out there. And in particular, again, it doesn't really talk much to those extracted with textual analysis. It's more correlated with macro ones. It's more volatile than macro ones, though, and the peaks are more distinct. And that's actually why we hope we are going to be able to identify shocks in a VR analysis using our indicator. Okay. Now, the question, given that I'm already sort of short in time, the question we want to address now, after producing our GFU proxy of global financial uncertainty, really is if we identify GFU shocks at a global level, do they matter for explaining the falling output during the Great Recession? That will be the question we want to address. So we move to a simple VR analysis in which we have three indicators. Our indicator, the global financial cycle a la Miranda-Griffin array, and the world industrial production measure by Baumeister and Antti. Okay, so these are the three indicators. So we estimate our use form VR for a sample which ends in 2019 month 4, because of the fact that Miranda-Griffin array's global financial cycle indicator actually ends there, so it's really data availability. There's also reasons that might suggest you not to involve COVID-19 observations in a VR analysis with peak coefficients, and Silence and Briniceri for discussions here. So we propose two identification schemes to identify GFU shocks, a recursive one with GFU first, and a non-recursive identification in which we exploit a set of restrictions in order to shrink the set of models that would be kind of mathematically consistent with the data, but not necessarily equally interesting from an economic standpoint. We have event-based restrictions. Basically, we want to have big shocks, GFU shocks, in correspondence of a few events that must be associated to a jump in financial uncertainty at the global level. Some restrictions in order to separate, basically, global financial uncertainty shocks and global financial cycle shocks, so second and first moment shocks at the global level. And then correlation restrictions in order to be sure that we are not confounding our GFU shock with oil shocks or US monetary policy shocks, which have been shown to be drivers of the global business cycle by Miranda-Griffin array and Baumeister and others. Okay, so this is this is the VR representation which we know. These are our event restrictions. So in these dates, we want to have really clear germs in the GFU. So we are going to interpret this as really big shocks to the GFU. The correlation restrictions are there to be sure that we don't confound our shocks with the shocks I mentioned before, so US monetary policy shock and oil shock. And then we have other restrictions in order to separate, possibly separate first and second moment global shocks at a financial level. Okay. These are input responses, so you have to be careful in explaining what I'm plotting. So the blue lines here are input responses implied by the models we retain in our set identified exercise. So these are the restrictions I just talked about. When you use these restrictions, you don't identify a single model. You identify a bunch of models that are all consistent, equally consistent from a likelihood standpoint with the restrictions we impose, and they all equally fit the data. They fit the data equally well. These responses suggest that in response to a jump in the GFU measure, you have a drop in financial activity, basically, and world output tends to suffer. That will be the idea. Now, obviously, you can estimate recursive VR, which is actually what I anticipated before. The green bands here are 90% confidence interval bands, and you see that you don't necessarily get all the models we produce with the non-recursive identification scheme. We believe this is actually kind of, suggestive evidence in favor of the fact that a recursive VR, will not necessarily capture all what you want to capture when it comes to the responses of the global financial cycle and world industrial production to a GFU shock. Okay. The median peak effect is minus 0.27%, say minus 3% on world industrial production, but this is actually an average estimate, which doesn't focus on the Great Recession, which is actually what we want to do here. So basically what we do here is the following. We have a metric to measure, basically to quantify the impact of global financial uncertainty shocks on the global business cycle indicator we use. And basically, we want to compare the actual series, the world industrial production measured by Baumeister and Hamilton, to the counterfactual one we would have observed in absence of global financial uncertainty shocks. And notice that we do this exercise with our set identified DAR. Therefore, we have different models, possibly telling different stories when it comes to the cost that we are kind of trying to quantify in terms of output at a global level. Okay, so now we are gonna compute this number, basically this loss for all the models we have. We have about 450 models, if I recall, retained in our set identified framework, just to be sure about what we are doing. So basically, we have different models telling us that the loss can be pretty different to some extent. It can go from 3% to 27% in terms of world industrial production loss again per year. And the median value is 13%. So the 13% I was kind of anticipating at the beginning of my presentation is the 13% related to the loss at a global level you get during the Great Recession, according to our VR analysis. And again, it's a loss you have to think of determined by the presence of global financial uncertainty shocks. Okay. Now, there's a certain variety here of estimates. These are all retained models, again, equal likelihood, so we can't really discriminate between them or among them. Notice, for instance, that this is the minimum loss model. So here, basically, you see that the drop in the GFU shocks, you don't change much the path of the actual world industrial production series, while this is a maximum loss. If you drop our shocks, you do actually change the path of the world industrial production series. I mean, here the blue line is the truth, and so the truth is, well, driven by our shocks, or also by our shocks. You see, dropping our shocks, the global financial uncertainty shocks, we would have observed a softer, actually, recession at a global level. Okay, so these are different readings of the data. Can we use these different readings of the data to learn something more about the relationship between the real loss and the financial loss? And that's actually what we do here, uncoupling the two panels I just showed you in the previous slide with the corresponding counterfactual path of the global financial cycle in absence of global financial uncertainty shocks. Okay, and here you see when there's no match in terms of real loss, there's not even match in terms of financial loss in terms of global financial cycle. While when there's a big loss from a real standpoint, there seems to be also a big deterioration when it comes to the financial side. Okay, so these are just two models, but what we can do now is to correlate all the losses from a real and financial standpoint in order to see if there's something in our retained models or not. Okay, and this is actually what we find. So we find a positive relationship between the global financial, so the loss at a global financial cycle level induced by global financial uncertainty shocks, and the loss at the real level globally induced by the same shocks. Okay, again, what this means is that the more financial markets are deteriorated at a global level, the larger the real loss is again at the global level. Okay, and this is a correlation, not necessarily causality. It's caused by GFU shocks, if you believe in our identification strategy, but then it's a correlation between the business cycle, the real business cycle, and the financial cycle. Still, it's interesting because this is actually consistent with some research on the US economy, regarding the presence of a finance uncertainty multiplier. So the fact that the financial markets, actually the deterioration in financial markets magnifies the real effects of uncertainty shocks. Bloom and others have a paper for the US. Here, this would be like the interpretation at the global level of this finance uncertainty multiplier. I guess I am done with my presentation. This is my wrap up. We believe we are producing a global financial uncertainty proxy that makes sense. So it spikes in correspondence of easy to label global events. It's correlated with proxies for the US when it comes to financial uncertainty. We find it to be a driver of the global financial and the global real cycle. The contribution of GFU shocks at a global level when it comes to the real cycle is non-negligible, and we find evidence consistent with a global finance uncertainty multiplier. thank you very much for your attention. Actually, this is a session organized by the Bank of Finland, and so kiitos paljon. Okay, kiitos.
Thank you, Efrem, for a very interesting presentation. And the discussant is Ambrogio Cesa-Bianchi from Bank of Finland. Ambrogio, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me while I load
Sure.
my slides?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you see my slides?
We can see.
Amazing. So thank you very much for asking me to discuss this paper, which has been presented by Efrem. The paper is about global uncertainty, and it's a topic that is very close to my heart, given that I worked on it for quite a long time. So what does this paper do? The main question that the paper would like to answer is whether we can measure global financial uncertainty and whether we can estimate the effect that arguably exogenous shocks to global financial uncertainty have on the real economy. Now, this is clearly a very challenging task, and there are two reasons for that. The first one is that financial uncertainty is a multifaceted object. So there are many assets that could contribute to financial uncertainty. And on top of it, there are many countries if you want to measure global financial uncertainty. So it's not obvious, how to combine all this different information. And the second challenging task is that the identification of exogenous movements in uncertainty is quite challenging. And I'm gonna get back to this point in a second. So what this paper does is to address both these challenging tasks by first developing a novel measure of global financial uncertainty from a fairly sophisticated factor model, and using a large number of asset classes, data from different asset classes in a large number of countries. And secondly, it studies the real effects of global financial uncertainty shocks in a structural VAR in which they develop quite interesting and novel identifying restrictions. So what are the main takeaways? The first one that I got is that this global financial uncertainty measure that the authors developed passes the duck test. If he swims like a duck and it looks like a duck, is probably a duck, which means that this measure basically behaves as we expect it to behave. The second point is that this global financial uncertainty, when there are shocks that hit this measure, exogenous shock that hit this measure, they can drive significant movements in global business cycles. And the figure that I took home, the most important one I think that I took home from the paper, is that a large chunk of the industrial production lost during the global financial crisis can be attributed to these shocks. And finally, there is an interesting point about this nonlinearity that concerns the role of the global financial cycle and this global financial uncertainty measure that has been developed in the paper. So my main comment is about identification, and I'm going to mainly focus on this point, and I'm not going to focus on the first part of the paper, which concerns the measurement of global financial uncertainty, which I think is really great work and improvement over previous work. Now, why do I want to talk about identification of uncertainty shocks? Well, because it's a very complicated task, and the main challenge when you want to identify these shocks is that global financial uncertainty, or in general uncertainty measures, could be the byproducts of first moment shocks. They could just be the endogenous response to some first moment shock that endogenously leads to an increase in the realized variance or in uncertainty. Now, the authors develop a fairly sophisticated way to identify these global financial uncertainty shocks, which is achieved with a combination of these four different elements: sign restrictions, event restrictions, correlation restrictions, and restrictions on the ratio of impulse responses, as Efrem described. Now, at least in my understanding, if each of these restrictions basically has some kind of rationale behind it. But if you wanted to focus on the challenge that I have on this slide, which is, can we disentangle these can we disentangle the effects of first moment and second moment shocks, then the sign restrictions and the event restrictions are not really useful in that respect. And the reason is that both shocks imply the same sign. And if you look at events where uncertainty has spiked a lot, these are events where also we witnessed large first moment shocks. The correlation restrictions I found very interesting is a very nice way to rule out a subset of the first moment shocks that might be driving the data, in particular monetary policy and oil shocks. And finally, these impulse response ratio restrictions to me seem to be key if you want to rule out the remaining first moment shocks in the data. So how do these ratio restrictions look like? This is what it's imposed in structural VAR that Efrem presented, which basically assumes that for a global financial cycle shock, the response of the global financial cycle measure is stronger than the global financial uncertainty measure. And conversely, if there is a global financial uncertainty shock, then financial uncertainty is going to spike more than what the global financial cycle measure would do. So here are my two questions for Efrem. The first one is, I kind of get the intuition for these ratio restrictions. I think they are kind of intuitive, but I was wondering whether there is kind of, we can say more to justify those. And is there any, for example, theoretical motivation behind these restrictions? And I think, if you were to add more details in the paper, that would be useful for the reader and to convince the reader that, we can safely impose them in a way that delivers what we want to achieve. The second question that came to mind when reading the paper was, is there any restriction that actually rules out the effect that output shocks can have on global financial uncertainty? And so again, you impose this restriction on the global financial cycle and global financial uncertainty, which to me is a way to disentangle between global financial uncertainty shocks and global financial cycle shocks. However, I kind of missed, maybe I just missed it in the paper, but I was wondering, whether we could say something about that. And this, in a sense, links to the paper we've been working on with Ashen Pesara and Alessandro Rebucci, where we exploited in a factor model cross-sectional patterns in the correlation between output growth and realized volatility to actually identify exactly this direction of causality, the effect of output shocks on uncertainty. Now, in our paper, we kind of gave up in trying to identify separately global financial uncertainty shocks and global financial cycle shocks. We kind of bundled them in a single object. And clearly, that creates an additional layer of complication. But I was wondering whether, it would be useful for what Efrem wants to do with his VAR to try and impose a zero restriction going from output onto, going from global financial uncertainty on output, which is basically the implication of our paper. And I'm going to stop here. So I think the paper is really interesting. The question is really important. As I mentioned at the beginning, is very close to my heart. The paper develops a new measure of global uncertainty, which I think builds on the existing literatures and improves on many dimensions what's been done in the past. I really like this kind of novel way of thinking about identifying restrictions to disentangle uncertainty shocks from first moment shocks. Even though, this is kind of the holy grail of the uncertainty literature in a sense. And so I guess my suggestion or comment to the authors is, can we do a bit more? And especially for the output, the relation between output and uncertainty, can we do a bit more to try and disentangle these two shocks? And the last thing I want to say is that I really found the nonlinearity point, what's been called the finance uncertainty multiplier, by Efrem, a really kind of interesting point, which certainly the authors, maybe they're already thinking about future research and new projects on that. And with this, I'll stop and I'll leave the floor back to Efrem, and happy to kind of discuss more. And there are many interesting aspects of the paper. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Ambrogio, for your discussion and very good questions to Efrem. Efrem, if you want to answer directly.
Yes, so thank you very much, Ambrogio, for the clever, thoughtful discussion. I truly mean it, in the sense that I like discussions where people make a few points that are really crucial for improving a paper. And I think this is an excellent example of this type of discussions. Unfortunately, I won't be equally clever or as clever as you were in addressing your questions. I think the first one is, I agree with you, this is the holy grail. So separating first and second moment financial shocks in particular, extremely complicated. So say ours is a first attempt, I guess, well, within our paper, I will say, when it comes to well, using these racial restrictions, to hopefully separate. Obviously, when playing the game of like writing the paper, we are kind of determining defending them. To be honest, I would like to do more along these lines. I agree with you. That's probably the part of the paper we need to improve the most in order to be more convincing along those lines. Now, I like the fact that we should embark theory, as we all should do every time, right, when writing this type of papers. So here, in a very weak type of defense, so what I'm going to tell you is what I read in the Furlanetto, Ravazzolo and Sarfer's paper, which is, in my opinion, the paper the first actually attempting to separate first and second moment shocks, financial shocks in particular, in a paper in which they were concerned with a very different research question. So there's a bunch of theoretical models you can simulate in order to defend this type of restriction. This type of restriction does not although the old calibrations of these models. So it's really details matter. So I can't claim, so I guess I can go and dig in the literature to find some theoretical defense for what we are doing, thinking of the US economy. And so your assumption is that I can kind of take something from the US to the global level, maintaining its validity. I can't claim though that they are super solid, rock solid restrictions, because details matter in those macro finance models, and so different calibrations might kind of play against proposing these type of restrictions. But for sure, say I take the point that we have to go to the macro finance literature and think harder, much harder about how to kind of theoretically support these restrictions. Output shocks, it's interesting because I like the fact that you wrote down output shocks, because there's a 50-50 type of approach to this paper and to papers in general where there's output inside and inside the VR, and some people are like, if there's output shocks here, we have to understand them better, and other people are like, what are output shocks really? So they don't mean anything because we have to think deeper about output shocks. But I 100% understand what you mean. So our attempt was to identify the two shocks out there that, in our understanding, have been shown to be drivers of output at a global level, to say, hey, at least these are not output shocks. So our shocks are not output shocks in the sense that they are not driving output at the global level. But there may be a variety of other shocks, as a matter of fact, driving output, which are not GFU shocks. I agree. So here, I don't have a good response like on the fly to are we sure we are separating our shocks to output shocks? If not, that no, we are not totally sure. We are not 100% sure. We need to work more on that. But here we really have to sit down and do something better than what we've done so far. I agree with you. But thanks for that, and please send me the slides, because it's going to be very precious stuff for us in improving the paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Efrem. There's one question from Jokivuolle.
Thanks, Efrem. I'm just curious about the following thing. Markus Brunnermeier and I believe it's Sannikov, together with Sannikov, they have this idea of the paradox of paradox of volatility, which I suppose means that the risks may be piling up while the actual volatility is paradoxically low. Sorry, I cannot recap the mechanism here, but just wondering if that has any relevance in the literature here that you're representing.
So thanks for the question. So it might again, I have to go back to that paper to understand if and how much we have to relate to that type of literature. Say that here what we are not doing, and it's one of the weaknesses of this paper, to be honest, is to separate uncertainty and realized volatility. So if you are concerned with risk, perceived risk, expectations about the future versus something that has already happened, like realized volatility, this is not the paper for you, in the sense that admittedly here we are taking as a proxy of global uncertainty what's realized uncertainty, as a matter of fact. But there might be some, and in this sense, here we are finding something which is, I guess, more in line with the literature popularized by Bloom and others. So when uncertainty goes up, there's a variety of models suggesting that consumption might go down at a domestic or global level, and investment might go down at a domestic or global level for different mechanisms. So I don't have necessarily the Brunner-Meyer and Sannikov mechanism in mind when I interpret my results. But again, I mean, I think it's a good suggestion that going back to that paper, to think if we need to relate to that story or not, and why. So I take it as a suggestion to reread that paper, really.
Thank you, Efrem. We can take one more question from Alessandro.
Hi, Efrem. Very nice paper. A couple of suggestions. The first one, I'm not entirely clear why you want to have the global financial cycle in there, which is a fuzzy concept itself. It's not a concept that is clearly measurable directly from the data, or univocally you can univocally pin it down from theory. So I'm wondering whether there you're making your life more difficult than necessary. And a second suggestion is to look in what Chris Sims with Brunner-Meyer and a couple of other co-authors have done in terms of identification, exploiting shift of volatility over time. Yeah. Because it could be that an output shock has different implications and financial volatility shock for the second moments of the variable themselves in a time series. Yeah. That may give you some leverage to distinguish first from second moment shock. Thirdly, the third variable you may want to put there is actually the implied vol realized vol spread, which is in finance is typically studied as having information, because the gap between the two is related to the distinction between first and moment shock. So this is the paper by Gidio and co-author in the Review of Economic Studies. That could be, I think, a third variable more informative than the global financial cycle.
Okay, so thank you very much,
Alessandro. Quick answer. And then
this is the second time that Alessandro provides us with feedback, so thank you very much twice, also for the other time. Yeah, so global financial cycle, we felt like we need to distinguish between first and second moment financial shocks, but I agree with you on the fact that it's an estimated factor, also confounding to some extent by itself first and second moment elements, and so it's not even clear that, I mean, to some extent we are shooting against our own feet, because we are fighting second moments with second moments, and so I agree with you on the fact that we can argue that we shouldn't be there. Heteroscedasticity, I would like to have a longer sample possibly to identify the regime breaks there. We start in 92 as a sample, although it might work because we got a couple of big jumps actually in the sample. So we might think about that. Implied vol, realized vol, it might be an alternative way to go. So that we didn't, I mean, I didn't think about that. I don't know about Giovanni. So yeah, so we'll have again a look at Giulio and others to understand how much we can embark out of that idea at a global level. But thank you very much, Alessandro. Very kind.
Thank you very much, Efrem and Ambrogio, for the presentation and very good discussion. I think we are almost on time. And at this moment, I would leave the floor to Esa Jokivuolle to chair the next two sessions. And thank you very much from my behalf. Esa.
Okay, thank you, Juha. And the next paper is going to be presented by Michaela Elfsbacka Schmöller from the Bank of Finland. So Michaela, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll quickly share my slides. Can you see them?
Not yet, but I hope they are coming. Now we can
see them.
Now on full screen as well. Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much for including this paper into the session. So this research is about endogenous technology scarring and fiscal policy, and let me start off right away with the motivation for this line of research. So, COVID-19 has hit the global economy in unprecedented scale. And most studies so far, however, have focused especially on the short to medium run effects of the COVID-19 crisis. However, given the scale of the output drop in the context of the ongoing crisis, it's also essential to look into potential long run effects in this context. And especially like when looking into previous recession episodes, for example, illustrated here in the slides by means of the United States and the Euro area following 2008, what you observe is that we observe substantial hysteresis effects with aggregate output basically never returning to its pre-crisis levels and still actually to date ranging below the pre-crisis trend, while at the same time advanced economies also experienced a substantial further deceleration in the productivity slowdown in the context of the crisis. Now, crucially, we observe, however, in the context of this crisis also that scarring effects have substantially also influenced the policy debate since the outbreak of COVID-19, in which policymakers specifically also emphasize the role of monetary and fiscal policy in this kind of context in the prevention of scarring and long-term output losses. And indeed, also and differently to previous crises, especially from the viewpoint of the Euro area also, COVID-19 has been accompanied by substantial fiscal expansions in contrast to previous crisis episodes. Now, while the importance of fiscal policy in preventing scarring effects and further crisis-induced slowdown in total factor productivity is strongly emphasized in the current discussion, the interconnection of fiscal policy on the one hand and total factor productivity growth and long-run scarring on the other hand is at this stage, however, not well understood by the previous literature, and evidence on this issue is scarce. So this is also the case because in standard DSG setup, you typically postulate as a simplifying assumption also strictly exogenous technology in which technology growth is purely determined outside the model. However, due to the setup, these models also remain silent on the drivers of TFP in the first place. And this paper basically aims at bridging this gap by first of all, analyzing the macroeconomic effect of COVID-19 from the perspective of a DSGE model with endogenous total factor productivity growth. And in this setup, I'm studying the mechanisms underlying the COVID-19 shock and its effect over the short, but also the long run. And in addition, also the role of scarring effects and cycle trend interaction in this context. And to preview the results on that front already, like what the model predicts are substantial scarring effects where both actually the demand and the supply side factors underlying the COVID-19 crisis push into the same direction, namely to a pronounced further deceleration in productivity, improving investment, and thus an intensification of the productivity slowdown subject to permanent output losses in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. Then another main point of this analysis is to study the fiscal policy and the endogenous productivity enhancing investment and total factor productivity growth. In this setup, I'm looking into government, the effect of government spending in this case, and also especially the role of the stance of monetary policy, then also in the setup, and the role of monetary fiscal interaction. And here, while the main result is while in normal times outside the ELB, government spending crowds out actually productivity improving investment and would thus further intensify scarring along these lines. Government spending can be a very effective tool at the effective lower bound in preventing scarring and in helping the economy return to its pre-crisis trend level, basically. However, now, since growth is now endogenous, there's a whole new set of options for fiscal policy under endogenous technology growth in this setup, besides traditional government spending, and basically in the form of growth policies such as subsidies to productivity improving investments in the DSGE setup now. And they have this advantage that they boost aggregate demand at present, while at the same time directly targeting investment in productivity and through that preventing long-term scarring in the context of the crisis. Now, yeah, so I won't have time to go through the model in much detail, but I'm focusing on the most important point, and this is exactly like the endogenous growth process in the setup, because otherwise the model is a standard medium-scale DSGE model in the spirit of Smets and Wouters, with cover price and wage rigidities, investment adjustment costs, as well as an effective lower bound constraint. And crucially, and differently to the standard DSG model, however, total factor productivity is no longer strictly exogenous, but instead it's modeled endogenously in the form of a two-stage growth process in the spirit of Comyn and Gertler 2006. And in this setup, basically total factor productivity is driven via two margins. The first one is research and development, which determines basically the technological frontier, and innovation occurs in this setup following Roma 1990 through horizontal innovation. That means through expanding varieties and intermediate goods. And however, in order for new technologies or new innovations to translate into actual productivity growth, they first of all have to diffuse to the wider economy, which is why the model also features a costly technology adoption choice, which firms basically make whether or not to incorporate a new technology in the production process. And then all in all, you end up with total factor productivity in this setup, basically still as a component in the form of a standard technology shock, which basically measures total factor productivity on the firm level. And in addition, you have an endogenous component of total factor productivity, which is exactly driven by these two margins here. And this is the component which is the endogenous growth component basically here. Now, and in this setup, I'm studying the COVID-19 shock as a combination of a health-specific demand shock and on the one hand, and supply-side disruptions on the other hand. And yeah, so all in all, I don't have too much time, but still a few words about the R&D sector. So as I said, like growth occurs through expanding varieties as in Roma 1990. And all in all, it's basically innovators which choose about their degree of investment in research and development, and according to the innovators production function here. And in the end, they choose the R&D efforts to maximize the expected payoff, meaning the gains from R&D versus the costs of undertaking R&D investment in the setup. And then on top of that, the diffusion margin, the technology adoption margin, in which then the competitive sectors of adopters shortcut basically for each and every firm making this decision individually. They then also decide endogenously about whether or not to incorporate new technologies in production, where then the probability of successful adoption is increasing in the adoption effort which is undertaken, and which is also costly from the viewpoint of the adoption sector. And then in the end, like the adopters weigh the adoption costs against the expected gains from technology adoption as stated here. And in the end, you have the low motion for the adopted technologies, which gives you this endogenous component of total factor productivity determined endogenously in a general equilibrium setup within the model. Now, yeah, I will skip the remaining part of the paper here, but maybe, yeah, quickly about monetary policy. Monetary policy is basically modeled in the form of a standard Taylor rule. However, it may be constrained by the effective lower bound here. Now, about the decomposition of the COVID-19 shock, what does COVID-19 mean from the perspective of this model? So to make this clear from the start, it's not an epidemiological model, but more I'm considering like different types of shocks underlying the COVID-19 crisis and how they then play out basically within the model I just described. And the first element here is basically the demand shock element, which I call the health-specific demand shock. And within this shock, the main mechanism is that agents cut back consumption due to the risk of contracting the virus in exposed sectors. And this is basically a shock which distorts the Euler equation, which depresses aggregate demand while raising at the same time aggregate savings. So this is the demand shock component. And then on top of that, I'm also considering another important element of the COVID-19 shock, namely in the form of supply side disruptions. And this captures disruptions to aggregate supply, which may emerge, for instance, from containment measures, supply chain disruptions, and also lockdown policies and other production constraints in the setup. And I model this in the form as a direct, in the form of a direct shock to firm level total factor productivity. Now, directly to the effect of these shocks separately and then in combination. So this health-specific demand shock basically depresses key economic variables such as output, consumption, and investment. And due to its depressing effect on aggregate demand, as you can see here, it leads to lower inflation. And however, importantly, from the perspective of this framework, it also induces a decrease in endogenous total factor productivity, as the shock depresses investment on R&D as well as in technology adoption due to the decreased economic payoff in the crisis from undertaking these investments. And as you can see here, basically total factor productivity displays scarring effects, and importantly also persistent ones. So the model is subject to permanent output losses in this regard, and basically inducing a level shift in the long run output path. And now turning to the supply side disruptions here, similarly to the health-specific demand shock, this shock also induces a drop in key economic variables. Now looking into the inflation response, however, it has the opposite sign, meaning that it's inflationary. So from the perspective of these shocks, the effect is basically ambiguous, and it depends on the relative weighting on the shock. However, if you look at the role on total factor productivity, you see that there is a spillover from the supply side disruptions to further deceleration in terms of total factor productivity, as the recession induced by the shock again leads to a decline in productivity, improving investments, and an intensification of the scarring and long run output losses also from this channel. So while the inflation response is ambiguous, depending on the relative weighting of the shock, the effect on total factor productivity is unambiguous in this context. Now, and if you aggregate the shock into one COVID-19 shock, these two shocks into one COVID-19 shock, in the end, here in this example, I'm weighing the demand perspective more strongly because this is in line with what we have observed so far. But again, as I said, like the inflation response is ambiguous here. But even if you weigh it more strongly, you see that inflation decelerates less than, for example, in a purely demand-driven recession due to also the counteracting effect from the supply side. But however, like the scarring effects are prevalent irrespective of the weighting of the shocks. And in the end, one more remark here, in the end, it also matters how strong and how persistent these shocks are, because, for example, if you're assuming more pronounced shock here, you also will see an intensification of the scarring effects, meaning that the resolution of the underlying health crisis is also paramount from the perspective of the alleviation of scarring effects in the context of COVID-19. Now, what is the role of macroeconomic policy in this setup? Well, looking first of all into the role of monetary policy here is crucial because differently to the standard DSG setup, aggregate demand actually matters for the evolution of aggregate supply, meaning also that monetary policy can influence in the setup total factor productivity and hence the long run trend path also over the long run, meaning that monetary policy is non-neutral also over the long term. And as you can see in this slide, if the ELB bounds, you will see a substantial amplification of scarring effects, because like in this case, like under the blue line, when the zero lower bound binds, you will see a substantially more pronounced response into a downward adjustment in terms of total factor productivity and larger permanent output losses in this case when monetary policy is not active. And as to fiscal policy, like needless to say, like when monetary policy is then constrained by the effective lower bound, the costs of the ELB are also higher than under exogenous technology, and this naturally gives role for fiscal policy in this setup. However, like when now taking a look into the role of standard government spending in this setup, you see outside the ELB, you see that the presence of the endogenous total factor productivity mechanism in itself basically does not yet give you big multipliers in terms of due to the TFP component in normal times, because as you can see here, actually it works that way that expansionary government spending leads to a crowding out in not only physical investment, but also in productivity improving investment in R&D and technology adoption, and through that actually leads to a deceleration in total factor productivity growth relative to its initial trend. However, when you are at the zero lower bound, as you can see here by means of a simulation which shows you the response in a recession at the ELB in the absence of government spending, the blue line, vis-a-vis the same recession, but in which the recession is counteracted by expansionary fiscal spending, you see that actually this helps substantially in reducing the depth of the recession and also in reducing the scarring effects on the total factor productivity margin. So government spending can be a very effective tool in at the effective lower bound. Now, and also like basically comparing these two charts also highlights the important increased role of fiscal monetary interaction also under endogenous total factor productivity growth, because once accounting, because it basically flips the sign in terms of the response of endogenous TFP in this setup. And as I said in the beginning already, however, like under endogenous technology dynamics, there are various options for fiscal policy besides government spending, meaning also that there you have other options for the conduct of fiscal policy, which could for instance also occur in the form of growth policies. And while those policies are well established in the DSG setup, in the endogenous growth setup, they can now also be implemented in the DSG literature. However, in terms of the short-run demand stabilization tool, while at the same time also reducing the spillovers from cycle to trend and the scarring effects in the setup. And here I'm showing the fiscal support, the effect of fiscal support to research and development in a counter-cyclical way, basically. And as you can see here, it has the advantage that it raises aggregate demand at present while boosting R&D and future total factor productivity. And this type of policy is effective also outside the effective lower bound, so its sign does not necessarily depend on whether or not monetary policy is active in the setup. And due to the two-stage process, you also have the additional option to support technology adoption in the setup, and by means of subsidies. And as you can see here, this also leads to an instantaneous increase in total factor productivity, and is effective in supporting TFP and counteracting scarring effects also under active monetary policy. So I guess I'm running out of time. Maybe time to wrap up. So again, on the role of monetary fiscal interaction here. So as I said before, like a binding effective lower bound is more costly in this setting, owed to the scarring effects that it may produce and intensify. However, outside the ELB, government spending leads to crowding out, but it can be a very effective tool when a monetary policy is constrained and can bring about, can help return the economy back to its initial output path. And while fiscal support to R&D and technology adoption basically boosts demand at present, while also raising the long-run output path, and their effect is not conditional on the degree of activity of monetary policy. Yeah, and generally on the long-run effects of the COVID-19 crisis, we saw that both demand and supply side factors work to induce scarring effects in TFP. And from that angle, the model predicts an intensification of the productivity slowdown and permanent output losses following COVID-19. also, like, given from the viewpoint that most advanced economies are closed, have been closed, or at the effective lower bound of also before the crisis, you could expect an intensification of the scarring effects in this setup. And then, yeah, I discussed the effects of government spending already, but at the EIB, like, both tools can be very effective, but then the novel fiscal tools in the DSG context in the form of growth policies are basically more directly targeted at raising, counteracting the scarring effects, and are independent of the stance of monetary policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michaela. And the discussant will be Efrem Castelnuovo, please. Efrem, I don't hear you yet.
Yeah, sorry guys, sorry. There you go.
Yeah,
we should be fine now, right?
Thank you. Yes.
So I'm not seeing my slide. Can you see my slides?
We can see your slides and yourself.
Fantastic. Yes. So thank you very much for asking me to discuss this paper. So Michaela did a fantastic job in explaining what she does. So I just have a slide here to sort of wrap up the content of the paper, at least according to my understanding. Here we have a new Keynesian model that enables us to study the role of fiscal policy in presence of scarring effects. There's actually a first part of the paper in which Michaela wants to understand the effects of a COVID-19 shock, which is interpreted as a combination of demand and supply, well, demand and supply shocks on endogenous variables of interest, in particular in DTFP and inflation too. It's a policy relevant paper, absolutely. There's also a second part of the paper in which Michaela is interested in understanding the role of monetary policy interpreted as normal times versus effective or zero lower bound, and fiscal policy. Indeed, the fiscal policy has got a larger multiplier in presence of a passive or monetary policy or in presence of the zero lower bound. Okay, in particular, my understanding is that in normal times, government spending shock crowds out R&D, deteriorates technology, and that's actually the bad part of fiscal spending shocks when monetary policy is free to move. Inflation goes up, which is also another interesting prediction of the model, determined, I believe, by the fact that a G-shock is expansionary anyway, so output goes up in the short run. In presence of the zero lower bound, a G spending shock crowds in R&D, improves technology, the multiplier, the fiscal multiplier is higher, and inflation goes up anyway. So there's this robustness in terms of prediction of the model when it comes to the direction of inflation in response to a G shock. Okay, Michaela concludes the paper by suggesting a targeted fiscal policy is effective in the model because it supports aggregate demand. So these are fascinating research agenda. This idea of study scarring effects. And so if you're interested into what Michaela is doing, I'll strongly recommend you to have a look at her website because you'll find other contributions featuring this mechanism, which are again, I believe, fascinating. As contributions, and the mechanism is fascinating. So what I like about the paper is the mechanism, at least the idea of studying the scarring effects via R&D decisions and TFP formation, and also we have a deeper understanding of the fiscal monetary policy mix according to the model at least. I think the main challenge of this paper, I'm an empirical guy, so I would like to have more empirical support out of the objects proposed in this paper, as well as the implications of the model Michaela is playing with. So I'm gonna propose at least 2 points: a window test on inflation, and this is gonna be related to the COVID-19 shock Michaela is starting. Then the empirical validation of the model predictions, and this is going to be related to the G-shock and what the shock implies according to the model versus what we see in the data. I don't think I'll have time to talk about model calibration, although I think this is important too, and so perhaps later we Michaela will exchange words on how to think about it a little bit more. But so let me go to the window test on inflation. So the COVID-19 shock in the paper is a combination of demand and supply shocks. The pandemic shock relates to supply side disruptions interpreted or due to lockdown policies, production constraints, disrupted supply chains. But also a health-specific demand shock, which is actually pushing the business cycle in a different direction, and so and inflation in a different direction. And so, what are the inflation effects in particular here? Well, if the demand shock is dominant, the prediction of the model is an inflation slowdown. And according to the version of the paper I read, this might be this might go well beyond the duration of the pandemic itself. Okay. Now, I'm kind of thinking how to square this, kind of wondering how to square this with what we are observing in the data, where, you know, since the pandemic, we've seen a little bit of a variation of inflation. At the beginning, there was like a drop in prices, but then after like a stabilization, a temporary stabilization of inflation, we've been seeing for a little while an increase in inflation. These are two indexes, inflation indexes for the US, and here we are talking more about inflation over the target than inflation below the target. We know that the US monetary policy, so the Fed is not going to intervene anytime soon because of the average inflation target, but still, I mean, we are talking about inflation, which is about 2%. And so I would like to understand how Michaela thinks about that and how we can square the prediction of the model for a kind of long deflation after the COVID-19 shock with what we are observing in the data right now. So the second consideration again relate to the empirics, if you want, or the mapping between what the model predicts and what we can see in the data. Is the empirical validation on the effects, in particular on the fiscal spending shock. So my understanding of the fiscal spending shock in the model is the following. When we are in normal times, R&D and TFP should go down due to the crowding out effect Michaela talked about, while during the effective lower bound, the sign of the response of R&D and TFP should switch and become positive. Okay? Inflation always goes up, no matter where monetary policy is in. If it's like in normal times on in the zero lower bound. Okay? So I was kind of wondering what the data is saying. And so I estimated a VAR. My VAR figures a bunch of variables. New shocks are running in order to control for anticipated fiscal shocks, spending, output, revenues, inflation, and a policy rate. And then I added to this pretty standard fiscal VAR, R&D and a measure of TFP. R&D so TFP in particular, is the measure of TFP developed by Fernald and others. Okay, and then I estimated a recursive VR, which is justifiable under certain conditions in this literature. To be honest, for a variety of samples, some samples are the idea of the first two samples is. Let me get a long sample of data with versus without the zero lower bound. Here we are talking about US data. And then let me get a grade moderation plus grade recession and its aftermath type of sample. Again, we have a with versus without zero lower bound story here. And I wanted to check actually if the predictions of the model by Michaela are confirmed by the data or not. And in particular, if inflation always goes up, as well as if the zero lower bound presence versus absence leads to the switch in signs Michaela is talking about in her paper. Okay. So long sample with the zero lower bound, inflation goes down. Fiscal price puzzle. Is this a solid evidence or not? Is it surprising or not? It's a price puzzle, but it's a fiscal price puzzle which is becoming known in the literature, and people are working on that in order to write models to justify, to interpret this deflationary response of the economy after a spending shock. Okay, so again, this is something that may or may not be solid. It seems to me that in the literature, people are finding this more and more, and I would like to know what Michaela thinks about that, and how to square her model's predictions with this response of inflation. Now, let me drop the zero lower bound. In theory, we should observe a switch when it comes to the responses of R&D and TFP to a fiscal spending shock. Here, the response is positive for both variables, but it's also positive here for the longer sample, including the zero-hour bound for both variables. Okay, so the mechanism that powerfully is at work in Michaela's framework is not necessarily supported by this first pass of the data, if you want. And so I would like to understand if I'm getting something wrong, or if Michaela's got a story to kind of reconcile her model's predictions with this simple response. Now, interestingly speaking, what I'm showing is not necessarily robust to change in the sample. Actually, let me get a shorter sample, like a grade moderation plus a grade recession type of sample, and let me redo the exercise. And inflation goes up here. You see, inflation goes up, so the fiscal price puzzle I was talking about before is not even that is robust to changing the sample. I mean, there's discussions on the role of monetary policy in the 70s versus the 80s, which is not necessarily what Michaela is talking about in her paper, unless we can interpret passive monetary policy in the 70s as like policy as passive during the zero-hour bound. It would be good to have Michaela's thoughts about that. Anyways, here inflation goes up, R&D goes up, and TFP goes up in response to a spending shock. So if my understanding of the model is correct, this is a bunch of predictions which is supportive of Michaela's model. Okay. However, again, there's also this story about the zero-hour bound. So let me drop the zero-hour bound here to see if there's a switch in sign Michaela is talking about here. And unfortunately, again, there doesn't seem to be a big role for the effective lower bound or the zero-hour bound there when it comes to the response of R&D and TFP to a spending shock. Okay. So I guess this bunch of input responses is just, again, a preliminary evidence that Michaela may want to sort of elaborate on, possibly, in order to see if there's some solidity here and the model has to be amended or not to match the data. But I would like to have at least a discussion in the data, in the paper on what the model predictions are and what a VR analysis can provide us with in order to understand if we are talking about a mechanism which is an intriguing mechanism in theory, but in practice has got not much of an empirical relevance, or if differently, there's some empirical support for it, which will kind of strengthen the paper in my opinion. Okay. I see I have just 1 minute basically. So the last thing I would like to say, I guess, is that in terms of model calibration, so Michaela is referring to previous papers for justifying this calibration. Seems to be that the calibration may be at least discussed a bit more. In particular, not clear why price and wage indexation should be set equally and at that particular value. Calibr prices and wages also seem to be sort of symmetrically set. We have evidence since the Metz and Bauder's model on the fact that these indexation parameters as well as the Calvo parameters may be calibrated differently, and the model implications might be different, at least from a quantitative standpoint. And so I would like to, Michaela, to dig a bit deeper when it comes to the literature and calibrate things more in line with the literature, or estimate the model, or do an exercise a la Canova. Canova, back in 1994, proposed an analysis which doesn't require the estimation of the model. It's like there's a bunch of estimates for each given parameter, structural parameter of the model you're interested into. Just exploit them all, kind of, create a uniform distribution and draw realizations of these parameters, to see how the moments of interest here input responses change if they change. So this type of exercise would just require like sampling from densities in order to check the implications out of the moments of interest, for the moments of interest. It's an easy exercise to do. I think it will be informative. It will be a way to exploring the robustness of Michaela's predictions to, well, different calibrations, which are all equally reasonable, I would say. Okay. So wrap up. It's a nice paper, very intriguing, novel mechanism. Discarding effects should be studied, I believe. I think the role of fiscal policy and the monetary fiscal policy mix is actually, something we should study more. And so papers like Michaela's are more than welcome. I guess I would like Michaela to think harder about the empirics of what she's doing. And thanks a lot for asking me to discuss this paper.
Thank you very much, Efrem, not only presenting in this session, but also for this excellent discussion. We are a little bit short of time. Michaela, would you first like to respond to Efrem?
Yes, real quickly, thank you so much for the very important and very insightful discussion. I'm quickly referring, I guess, now to the most important points, and if okay by you, I'm going to contact you later on again to talk more about these empirical things, which were very interesting. So in general, like about inflation, so since inflation is not the main point of this paper, but it's still important for various reasons, which are actually are at this stage not that fully discussed in the paper. So also from that angle, it's very important, I think, to look into these things further on. So in general, about like the inflation, like temporary inflation increase we have observed over the past month, for example, in this slide, you can actually engineer this type of a mechanism here too by basically weighing these shocks in a different way, and this is somewhat arbitrary here. And of course, you can, you should perhaps link this more strongly with the data. So this is actually a nice suggestion. And in general, I would understand like the main implications from the model more in a kind of qualitative way in the sense, and not maybe too much go into like the direct predictions of, for example, how many percentage of scarring effects. So we predict based on the shocks that we have seen, but more like to understand the direction of the sign and so on, and the persistence of the response. And in general, inflation is actually, and fiscal policy in the setup is actually also important from another angle, because in general, like inflation dynamics are different than in the standard DSG model setup under endogenous growth, in the sense that actually this endogenous technology growth mechanism leads to a kind of a smoothing in the Phillips curve relationship, for example, in the sense that it's muted over time. And through that also, I think the paper should perhaps show the difference of the government spending response, for example, under endogenous versus exogenous technology. So I think this could be informative from this angle as well. And thanks a lot for all the empirical suggestions. I'm glad to look into this more strongly and to link it to the data. And in general, however, like as in terms of the model calibration that I used, it actually is very much in line with the estimated models of endogenous, like the same type of model estimated. I have done the same also in an earlier paper. So basically these calibration results come from an estimation also. I mean, I could show the estimation procedure in more detail here again, but like also like in terms of the Calvo parameters in the setup, actually like they change once you include the endogenous TFP mechanism. And this is kind of consistent also with other papers like that. So it's in line, it's not in line with the DSG literature under exogenous technology growth, but it's very much in line with the literature on endogenous TFP growth. And yeah, so nothing more. Again, like thank you very much for all the very helpful suggestions. I'm surely going to take them on board and be in touch later on again. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So thank you both. Given the time constraints and the fact that I don't actually see any raised hands at the moment, so I suggest that we continue directly to the last paper of this session, which will be given by Alessandro Rebucci. Please, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. Let me share my screen. I think you may have to. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can see them.
Yeah.
Very good. So by standing between you and the summer weekend and the end of the conference, I'll try to deliver as fast as I can. This is joint work with Alex Chudik, Kamyar Mohades at Cambridge, Aishem Pezaram and Mehdi Raisi at the IMF. This is work we did last year to try to think about the global implication of the COVID shock. So COVID, as we all know, it's a singular shock. A shock is a shock like no other. It involves a mixture of supply, demand effects. It was very large. It came about at light speed, and has also had implication for financial market. It entailed financial disruption. So identifying such a shock, which has not been realized earlier in the data, is a very difficult problem. And also its transmission, because of the financial frictions and because of the policy response, which has put the economy in a sudden stop for no economic reason other than containing the epidemic, is likely to have a nonlinear effect. So based on this consideration, what we do in this paper is to use a relatively simple idea to identify the shock. So we back out forecast revision from the IMF World Economic Outlook, which has global forecast, and then we spread them to a nonlinear specification of the GVAR to see the transmission. And we allow for nonlinearity, allowing for threshold effect consistent with the literature on the specification of those kind of model. And we nest in a slightly modified standard global vector autoregression specification. Then we run a bunch of counterfactual in the form of conditional forecast, and we back at the time when we wrote the paper, we were trying to think ahead what could be the likely impact, combining information from the shocks identified, as I mentioned, together with the information coming from the estimation of the GVAR on historical data. So taking into account the historical co-movement, the historical distribution of outcomes and the shocks in a bootstrapping proceeding. We have a lot of results. The forecast at the time was that growth would have, by the end of 2021, so we are still within the forecast horizon, would have been 3% below what it would have been in the absence of the shock. So what the model would have, what the growth forecast of the model would have been without the shock. China and emerging Asia coming out better, not surprisingly, especially at the time when this was done, than most other countries. UK and the US most severely affected among the advanced economies. A lot of heterogeneity, especially outside emerging Asia. Very wide uncertainty bands around these conditional forecasts. A lot of spillover, for example, as exemplified by the case of Sweden, which attempted to go by without lockdowns, but its outcomes in this exercise are pretty much in line with everybody else. And also some interesting results on global rates. We show that the shock bring down global rates, but much less so in advance. First of all, much less so than growth. So bad news for R minus G debate, and certainly for emerging market, nothing like the decline in advanced economy, but perhaps reflecting the fact that the emerging market use new tools and eventually engineer to keep them their local hill curve probably steepening less than in previous crises. And overall, these results kind of validate a very strong policy measure taken, especially in the United States, in Europe, but also in many other countries. So in the interest of time, I'll be very selective in what I'm going to show you. We start from a univariate specification of a simple threshold model with the threshold effect mean growth, and we compare advanced and emerging market. And the conditioning variable, by the way, is global volatility, is a more simple-minded proxy for this variable, but that's what we condition on in the threshold variable. Let me show the results over here. So for all advanced economies, we have that when global volatility is above a certain threshold, estimated to, in normalized terms, to this 0.15, and with probability 3.09%. Most countries have lower growth than otherwise. And down here is the pool effect. In emerging markets, the threshold is a little bit lower, so emerging market more sensitive. This happens more frequently, but estimated less precisely, possibly because the not truly global nature of the episode characterizing emerging market. Emerging market got in trouble and experienced volatility spilling over to the center on occasions. Think about long-term capital management debacle in '98 and the Russian default, which had global repercussion but originated at the center. So here we are identifying less precisely. Then we're going to set up these threshold augmented GVAR model. So let me take you through the specification. There are a few novelties relative to the typical GVAR specification. Only 4 variables at the country-specific level: growth, the long-term interest rate, real equity return, and the exchange rate. We collect them in this variable YT. 2 global variables as a proxy for common observable factor, the oil price and the global volatility variable that we use in the univariate threshold analysis. Then an observable global factor obtained as a weighted average across all countries in the sample of the country-specific variables, so global growth, world interest rate factor, a global equity market return, and the dollar. All these currencies are bilateral vis-a-vis the dollar, so you can think about the nominal effective exchange rate. We represent them by using weighting matrices, and then also the traditional star variable of the GVAR specification, which are weighted average with country-specific weight. So the weighting matrix here is country-specific, and the idea, if you want to, in an oversimplified way, is to think about Coase or Trock and Whiteman analysis of the international business cycle. You have a global factor, you have a regional factor. Here we're capturing these regional factors with these country-specific trade weights, and it will enter with a lag, while the global factors over here are contemporaneous, that enters with a lag. And then once we have all these variables, we construct by substituting essentially their specification, we aggregate into something that looks like a standard GVAR, and the reduced form innovation is a mixture of country-specific and global innovation. Next, we are going to introduce the threshold, and we're going to make it only output loading on it for simplicity. And we pull the parameter estimates. So the threshold does not affect all 4 country-specific variables, only the output equation. And then we need to think about the shock. So we start from the definition of reduced form residual, this ET. We want to forecast it 4 quarters ahead through the end of 2021. And we're going to add this omega term over here, which is the shock. And where does the omega term is coming from? Essentially, omega is the revision, the forecast revision in the IMF projection between the April 2020 and the December 2019. On the presumption that we are normally update every 6 months when there are shocks, big global events, they do the interim projection, that interim update is dominated by the direct effect of COVID. And then we load from the projection directly only the GDP data, and then we spread it to other variable by using the estimated historical variance covariance matrix for those innovation. So then we define our counterfactual simply as the difference between the forecast H period ahead relative to the forecast including the shock identified as I mentioned minus what the forecast would have been without the shock. So this is our counterfactual, And this is what is the distribution of this object that we are going to try to compute with bootstrapping method. So this is the slide I was looking for, how we essentially populate the variance covariance matrix, backing out from the data only the GDP forecast revision. So these are the countries and how they are organized in region. Let me show some results. So these are, as I mentioned, these are shocks minus control, where shock is the omega term imputed as I mentioned, and control is what the forecast would have been in the absence of the shock. The world is at the end of 2021 and pretty much still at the end of 2022, 3 percentage points below where it would have been with the trough here, which is below 5%. I don't think I have the time to go into the details. I mentioned that UK and the US, you see here minus 15% at the trough within 6 months, and the US is down here another 15% were the most affected. And you can see the heterogeneity and the very wide error bands. So a lot of uncertainty. And in the revised version of the paper, which I believe is on our website now, you can see some discussion of what these forecasts look like relative to actual, and we went surprisingly close in many instances to the actual. This is the Swedish example. You can see that outcome were forecasted to be even worse than when we compare shocks to only in all countries, including Sweden, and in all countries excluding Sweden. So it gives you a sense of that there is no way to escape if we take into account the linkages and the spillovers. These are the results for the interest rate, which I found particularly interesting. What you can see here, advanced economies, which with a big drop and then a reversion to control driven by the United States and in part the Euro area and the UK. Very different story for emerging market, where essentially based on historical correlations, you don't expect such a decline. Here the outcomes has been better than in this picture. And if you compare the drop in R with the drop in G, you can see that this is a move, is an unfavorable movement in the R minus G that we much think about fiscal policy. So I am, I think I am ready to wrap up. The COVID pandemic is a unique shock. Is not in historical data to estimate quarterly model. Because of the financial implications and because of the lockdown as a policy responses, it entails nonlinear transmission. And what we do in this paper, we use the GVAR methodology to think about is identify the initial impulse from a forecast revision in line in the spirit of much of ongoing literature on identifying all sorts of shocks from capital market. Here we do it with a reputable source of global growth projection. And we do find strong negative effect, not surprisingly very heterogeneous with wide uncertainty bands. And as I mentioned in the paper, we now document that we went relatively close to actual outcomes in several instances. Let me stop here. I have a few more considerations, but in the interest of time, I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. And the discussant will be Antti Ripatti from the University of Helsinki. Please, Antti.
Thank you. Thank you for asking me to discuss the paper. This is super interesting paper because it challenges our expectations of what happens in the post-COVID world. And in particular, what I find intriguing and interesting is first the heterogeneity across the countries and across the regions, and then the persistence of the growth suppression after the pandemic is over. So the aim of the paper is it's asking what is the effect of the COVID-19 on near-term economic growth and on long-term interest rates. And then the method it uses is to build up a threshold augmented multi-country model, which is called GGVAR. And indeed, the essential what it shows is that the effect of COVID is very heterogeneous, and it's also very persistent in advanced economies in particular. So the model variables, there are several vectors, but in essence, there is a set of country-specific variables. There's a GDP growth, long-term interest rate change, real equity prices change, and real exchange rate change. And this is called YIT. And then there are some global variables, which are oil prices, and then global stock price volatility. And this global stock price volatility is driving the threshold variable, threshold effect. So if it exceeds an estimated level, that's estimated from the data, then it's going to suppress the GDP growth. Then there is a transformation, a linear transformation of the country-specific variables in two ways. First, there is a global aggregates. These are tilde variables, where the aggregation is done from country-level variables, use the fixed GDP weights. And then there's a country-specific external variables, which uses country-specific trade weights. This is to model the impact of the, let's say, export demand or foreign inflation or relative prices in terms of trade effect for the particular country. And the novelty is that model takes into account that these Y tilde and Y star variables, they are just linear combination of the original country-specific variables. Okay, then how about the model structure? For these global factors, GT, which was the oil price change, and global stock price volatility, and for the global aggregated, the world economy variables, there is a VAR model with one lag. This means that this global volatility variable is endogenous. So the model is capable endogenously generate this threshold effect. So given a shock in the model, it can generate volatility such that it exceeds the threshold level and suppress the GDP growth. So this is a nice feature of the model. Then you can think that there is a country-specific VAR1 model with exogenous variable. The exogenous variables in the country-specific VAR are global factor variables, global aggregates, and then the country-specific external variables. And then in each country-specific VAR model, there is this switching constant term. So whenever the stock price volatility variable exceeds a certain threshold value, which is different for advanced economies and for emerging economies, then that's going to cause decline in the GDP growth. So that's kind of the uncertainty, but it's good to remember that this variable is endogenous in the model. So there can be persistent effects due to this threshold effect. And then the model takes into account these identities between global aggregates and country-specific aggregates, And when all of these models are stacked together, these country-specific models, when they're stacked together, what it results is a huge restricted VAR model. That's a way to understand the model. It's like a huge restricted VAR1 model. Okay. So how the COVID is modeled here. It's a sequence of innovations in this huge VAR model that replicates the IMF forecast revision between January 2020 and April 2020. So it's just an innovation vector in this VAR that replicates this forecast revision. That's how the shock innovation is modeled. So to facilitate my discussion, I go a bit to the details how this is done. So let's call XTD the set of all the variables, country-specific variables. That's a vector that contains country-specific variables, and those are the values that existed in January 2020. Sorry, I have December here. The IMF forecast before the COVID. Then let's denote XAT as the revised forecast after the COVID emerged, the pandemic emerged. So then we have here the one-step forecast given the initial state of the world economy. And it's just a recursive VAR forecast conditioned on this period capital T information, which is the end of 2019. And now, how is the alternative path generated? We have some unknown shock innovation in first quarter and in another one in the second quarter. And how we get these shock innovations is that we just calculate the difference between the January 2020 forecast and April 2020 forecast, and the difference is called kappa 1, and then we can deduct what is the omega 1. Given this forecast update, we can deduct what is omega 1 and what is omega 2 and so forth. And this is done for the entire year 2020. Now, one have to bear in mind that the paper only utilizes the GDP growth rate forecast. No other variables from the IMF forecast. So we have to introduce a selection matrix in front of the XT. Now the thing is that actually the nice idea of the paper is that it utilizes the entire vector of shocks to generate this GDP growth forecast update. So it genuinely utilizes the entire shock structure and the covariance structure of the shocks. And so this reminds me, and this is my first point in my discussion, this reminds me that this is actually looks like a special case of the conditional forecast of the Wagner and Saab paper, 1999 paper, where one can condition information on the endogenous variables of the VAR model. So given this in mind, I have a couple of questions. So why you want to limit, when you look at this IMF forecast update, why you don't limit to the GDP growth revision only? Because I guess there is a full spectrum of the variables available. Then one have to bear in mind that this IMF forecast revision, it also includes the policy response for the pandemic and that mitigate the economic disaster. And then the forecast contains also some uncertainty. I don't know if IMF publishes any of forecast uncertainty measures, but given this Wagner and Sa approach, one could basically take that into account in calculating the conditional forecast approach. Then a second set of questions. Second set of question is related to this threshold effect. I think that's highly interesting. Now, because this in this exercise, this global volatility is endogenous. So I would love to see what is the response of this threshold term. Does this COVID shock, does it trigger such a big amount of volatility such that the threshold effect is actually causing this persistent impact, or is it different in different countries? So what is the role of the threshold effect in the path you calculate? And so hence, what is the response of this threshold variable in your model? So let me stop here. And I think this is a fascinating paper, and it has been really a pleasure to read it. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Antti. Alessandro, would you like to respond?
Yes, very briefly. Antti, first of all, thank you very much. This is an excellent discussion. I think you made it, in my attempt to not to use everybody's time, I rushed a little bit, and you did a great job in helping me presenting what we are doing. You got it exactly right. You raised three very good questions. Let me start in reverse and try again to be concise. The threshold is not as significant once estimated inside the big GVAR as when we estimate it in a country-specific way. So somehow here, there is the message that is important, and relative to literature, the effects that we find are large and precisely estimated. When we put it back into the GVAR, we tend to find what the literature does find, which is hard to document it, especially in quarterly growth. But nonetheless, in the spirit of a VR analysis where not everything is always statistically significant, is there and is at work, of course, for whatever it is estimated to be. Indeed, one could partial it out, right? Shut it down and compare with and without, and show that would be a good suggestion. You asked why not all variable. Obviously, the identification is, if you want, cute, but not completely clean. We do argue in the paper that, yes, there are more elegant and cleaner way to proceed, but they lack external validity. In any case, COVID is really difficult to identify. This was an attempt to minimize possible contamination from other things, right? So if you start to forecast, for example, the inflation rate or the exchange rate, you need to take into account a lot of things that go beyond the shock itself. On the possibility of including, in general, the framework is the one that you described. I don't know that specific paper, but for example, there is a new paper by Neil Shepard at Harvard that is discussing identification in this context, essentially spelling out assumption under which generalized impulse conditional forecast with allowing the variance combinatorial to be unrestricted provide valid causal inference of the type of counterfactual that we are doing. And I guess that the Tao's paper must be in that spirit. The reason why we don't use or don't attempt to construct a measure of dispersion of the forecast themselves is that we thought it was clean to assume that what is embedded in the GVAR historically cannot be too different than what we would be backing out by treating the forecast themselves. But that would be an alternative way of proceeding. And while here there are some suggestions on how to go about specifying such a model in the central banking context, in a modeling context, the contribution here was primarily an applied one to help us thinking about COVID. But I really appreciate your discussion. I look forward to review your slides.
Thank you. Would there be any other questions?
I have a quick one, if I may. Ambrogio here. Ciao Ale.
Hi.
Please.
My question is something that I missed during your presentation. I see you have both weighted averages of variables with GDP weights as well as trade weighted averages, and I was wondering, I kind of missed why you need both in the model.
So
what's the intuition for that?
It took me some time as well to read Aschenmann. This was his idea. I would have gone the way we went in our work. It's a little bit subtle. So it's an acknowledgement that we have observable and unobservable common factors, right? The observable, oil and global vol. Unobservable, you extract them from the data. Why those variables? Well, because there is a monetary factor, which is global monetary policy. There is an international business cycle, that's global growth. There is the dollar, which is a driver of exchange rate premium. And there is a world interest rate. That's what those variables capture. Then there are, Aschenmann likes to call them network effect, but in fact are regional factor, if you will. And then the traditional star variable of the GVAR methodology capture that, because the trade weights give different emphasis to different trade partners. And we know that trade is the most fundamental linkage among this economy, at least at the macro level, at least the quarterly frequency. Now, in order to avoid or to keep it clean, notice that unlike the traditional GVAR, the network or regional factor enter with a lag. Okay, they don't all enter contemporaneously because they would be too highly correlated. So that's the idea and the way it is done.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Thanks for clarifying.
Any other questions? Okay, then I might suggest that we officially close the session, but people are certainly welcome to stay online here and continue more informal discussions if you wish. But let me once again thank you all for the great presentations and discussions and making this a wonderful Bank of Finland special session in the CEBRA annual conference. So thank you very much and have a good weekend. But as said, so please feel free to stay here for a few minutes if you like. Thank you.
Thank you, Esa, and thank you, everybody. Was I hope I was on another session earlier. I say I hope that we don't have a third year of COVID, so we can start to resume getting together in person. It's getting boring through Zoom all the time. Very efficient but boring.
Indeed.
Yeah. Thank you also from my behalf for contribution to our session. It's very good.
Thanks, everybody. Sorry, I said so.
It's great to see you.
Very much.
Thanks a lot.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye.
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 Ciao. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Antti. Hope to see you again soon.
Yes, you too.
Please do send me the slide.
Yes, I will. Thanks.
Fantastic show.
What's that?
Oh, I was just talking to somebody.